When you prepare to deliver a sermon, you have to decide, of course, what it's going to be about. That's no surprise to you. And sometimes you have a lot of moving parts. And you have to decide how you're going to assemble them. So let me tell you the parts that I was looking at today, at the same time as I ask you to make sure that your mask is over your mouth and nose. Because you see, I can see you. Here are the parts. First of all, this is Shabbat Shirah, the Sabbath of a song, because of the song of the sea. And not only the men sang, but as Claire, our bat mitzvah, pointed out this morning, the women sang too, because Miriam led the women in a song, and in fact, her Haftorah is right before the song of Devorah, the song of Deborah. So that tradition of women singing continued. So it's about men and women singing, but there are more pieces, because Shirah in Hebrew doesn't only mean song, it also means poetry. And you can understand why, because most song lyrics are really poems, right? You can't really put this sermon to a song, but you can put poetry to songs. So shir means in Hebrew both poem and song. The earliest poems in Hebrew were songs, the Psalms of David. They were sung in the temple. But we have more pieces, because Monday is Martin Luther King Day. So we also have the piece of justice. And Monday is Tu B'Shvat, which means we also have the piece of trees. So we've got song, poetry, trees, and justice. It's a lot to fit into a sermon. Don't be scared. Doesn't mean it'll be a long sermon. It just means it's a lot to fit in. And I thought I would start with the best known poem, part one, about trees, part two. Because early in the 20th century, a poet who's otherwise not known wrote a very famous poem in English called Trees. His name was Joyce Kilmer. And the opening lines of the poem became very famous. I think that I shall never see a poem lovely as a tree. In other words, even though I'm a poet, I can't write anything that's more beautiful than a tree. And some of the images in the poem, it's a short poem, you can read it when you go home, became famous too. Like a tree that looks at God all day and lifts its leafy hands to pray. Right? Now you can imagine a tree like this praying to God. So the images are beautiful. And this idea that what you're singing to is ultimately singing to God's beautiful world, that's exactly what Shirat Hayam is about. When the Israelites sing after they cross the sea, none of them say, "Ha, we beat the Egyptians. We win, you lose." No, they say, "God delivered us." Because ultimately, art, human art, is an expression both of gratitude and of appreciation for this greater world in which we live. And those artists, singers, painters, writers that we most love are the ones who allow us to see the world in a new way. I'll bet before I gave you that image, very few of you ever thought of the tree branches as arms that were praying. But it's a new way to see the world. And that's exactly what Shirat Hayam does too. It allows us to see the deliverance as a product of God's wonder. And this, I think, is the deeper message of Martin Luther King Day that sometimes gets ignored. Remember that he was Reverend Martin Luther King. And he really believed that deliverance, as much as human beings have to work for it, comes from God. It's why he talked about the Exodus over and over again. Because it's right there in our founding documents. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Why? Do you know the next phrase? Because they are endowed with by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. In other words, because it's a legacy of God that we're created equal. Not because I say it or you say it or the Constitution says it, but because God says it at the very beginning of the Torah that we read this morning. That every human being is B'Tselem Elohim, is in the image of God. And all of this, you see, ties together. God's world, poetry, song, and justice. All of it on Shabbat Shirah. Now I want to tell you how Joyce Kilmer's poem ends, in case you don't know the ending of the poem. It says, "Poems are made by fools like me, but only God can make a tree." So I want to change that a little bit to fit this morning. I want to say, sermons are made by fools like me, but only God can split a sea. Shabbat Shalom.